Hello, Patriots! Welcome again to the channel. Let me start off by wishing everybody a happy Flag Day. This Sunday, June the 14th, is National Flag Day. I'll be telling you a story about that a little bit later, so go get the red, white, and blue and wave it around today to celebrate our nation's wonderful flag. Well, the topic for this video is racism. That's the big hot issue nowadays, so it bears worthy to be talked about. Let me start off by saying point blank that racism is wrong. But let me be more clear on that issue to say all racism is wrong. Racism against a black person would be wrong, and racism against a white person would be equally wrong. I always like to start off by thinking, what was the Bible's position on the topic of the day? And this topic of racism. Notice what the Bible says about this in the book of Romans, chapter number 3 and verse number 23. It says, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." You notice it doesn't say that one race sinned more or less than any other race. It says, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." The ground at the level of the cross is equal for everybody. Notice what else the Bible says in the book of John, chapter 3, verse 16. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Notice there's two things in this verse here that really could deal with racism. It doesn't say, "For God so loved one race more or less than any of the other races." It says, "For God so loved the world." And it says, "Whosoever believeth in him," Jesus Christ, "shall be saved." When God made the races, he made one race, the human race. And when you get up to Judgment Day before him, you're not going to have to answer you or this race or the other race. He's going to have one question that'll be most important. What did you do with his son, Jesus Christ? So in God's eyes, it is the human race, not all these different ones that we're dealing with. But there's another biblical principle that deals with racism, and I want to share it with you. It comes from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 18 and verse 20. Notice what the Bible says. "The Son shall not bear the iniquity of the Father, neither shall the Father bear the iniquity of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him." So what do we see here is that the Bible is teaching that you are responsible for yourself, and you are not responsible for the sin or the iniquity of what your forefathers did before you. That is a biblical principle. But the left wing today is pushing against this biblical principle and pushing the idea that white people somehow need to apologize for things that they never did, but things that their forefathers did. I'll even give you another quote. This comes from the economist Thomas Sowell, who happens to be a black guy. Notice what he says. He says, "Have we reached the ultimate stage of absurdity where some people are held responsible for things that happened before they were born, while other people are not held responsible for what they themselves are doing today?" It's a great quote from the black economist and conservative Thomas Sowell. So let us ask a few questions here about this. Should you confess to a crime that you did not commit? Well, of course, no. That would be very dishonest. Should you have to suffer for a crime that somebody else committed? Well, no, that would be injustice. Let me give you an example here. Let's say, for instance, let's say your cousin, a cousin of yours that lives in another state, a cousin who you've never met in your entire life. They go off and they rob some store. Should you be responsible for them robbing that store? Would it be right for the store owner to come over and say, "Hey, you owe me money because this guy stole from my store. He stole my entire life savings"? What if your cousin that lives in another state that you've never met shot the store owner and killed the store owner? Would it be right for the family of the store owner to come over to you in another state and say, "Hey, this person that you've never met, they're related to you, so you have to pay me for the goods that were stolen, you got to pay for all the money that was taken, and you got to make up for the life that was lost because your cousin that you've never met in another state did this"? Well, no, everybody would say that's absolutely insane to hold one person responsible for this who had absolutely nothing to do with it. And yet that is what is being pushed today from the left in this idea of raising up the idea that some people are racist because of actions of their forefathers who may or may not have owned slaves. I did a little bit of research to look up how many people actually owned slaves in America when the Civil War broke out. If you look at the census of the year 1860, which is the year 1 year before the Civil War broke out, it shows that 1.4% of Americans own slaves. Now, do you realize what that means? It means in the reverse, 98.6% of Americans didn't own slaves. However, that's not the impression that you would get from the leftist media or from the Black Lives Matter movement or from a lot of politicians going on that today. They'd like to give you the idea that all white people owned slaves back in the 1800s, which when we look at the census, that's not true, is it? 98.6% of them did not. So not only have you never owned a slave, there's a 98.6% chance that none of your ancestors ever did either. Think about that. Oh, and by the way, let me just throw in something extra for you. I was able to find a historical account from the year 1830. In the year 1830, it says that there was about 13.7% of the black people in America were free at that time. Now remember, this is before the Civil War. And in that year, guess how many slaves that free black people owned? More than 12,000. Just thought I'd throw that in there for free, and you can chew on that all that you would like. I don't know about the rest of you all, but I am about, as my dear sainted mother used to say, I am about sick and tired of being called a racist just because I happen to be a white guy. Do you realize that it was white people in the Civil War, Union troops, the vast majority being white guys, that died at a rate of 360,000 of them, not to free themselves, but to free other people? This is the first time in all of history when people rose up not for their own rights, but for the rights of others. And 360,000 of them died so that other people could be free. And I have to ask the question, where is the recognition and remembrance of that? Another thing that I would just be, as my mother used to say, just makes me sick. Another thing that just makes me sick is whenever a white person disagrees with a black person on an issue. And it can be any issue. It can be a political issue. It can be a moral issue. It can be a social issue. It can be a religious issue. Any issue that you want. If they disagree with them, then those on the left immediately want to say, well, that's because they're a racist. Just because you disagree with a person does not mean that you're a racist. Maybe you disagree with a person because you have a different opinion than the other person. And it's crazy because everybody's just labeling you, well, if you disagree, then you're obviously a racist. That is not so. And how do you know when you are winning an argument with a left-wing liberal? It's when they call you a racist. And I've had many people, especially in recent days, that have called me a racist. And nothing could be farther from the truth. Not a racist bone in my body. But those on the left and those that are pushing this agenda don't seem to be very interested in the truth, and they don't seem to be very interested in justice. They seem to be interested in just forwarding their agenda. And it's an agenda of division, trying to divide everybody up into all these different little groups, and then setting the different groups against each other. Kentucky's motto is, united we stand. And there's those today that are not trying to unite us, they're trying to divide us. My fellow Kentuckians, may this motto not be our motto in word only, but also in deed. United we stand. Standing together leads us also to our final point. And we've been talking a lot recently about the Confederate symbols and the Confederate flag. Many people today say, well, the Confederate flag is a symbol of racism and slavery and oppression. Well, if you were to take that opinion, then would not the American flag be the exact opposite of all that? It would be anti-slavery, anti-racism, anti-oppression. Because remember, it was the American flag that flew in battle against the Confederate flag. So instead of taking a knee and kneeling to disrespect the American flag, I think it'd be a good idea to remember the 350,000 who fought under the banner of that flag to end oppression, who died to fight and fought against slavery and against racism. Wouldn't that be a better idea? And on the same token, if you're going to say, well, the Confederate flag stood for this, then the American flag who fought against that would stand for the exact opposite of that now, wouldn't it? And that leads us to our last story, a historical account that I bet a lot of leftists would never tell you about. It starts in the year 1840. At that time, there was a man by the name of William Carney. And he was born into slavery, again, 1840, about 21 years prior to the Civil War. However, he was able to escape slavery using the Underground Railroad. And he went up to Massachusetts and was able to join some of his family up there. He learned to read and write in secret. And then when he was 18, he says he intended to enter the ministry as a pastor. He later wrote, as in a newspaper article, he said these words, quote, "Previous to the formation of colored troops, I had a strong inclination to prepare myself for the ministry. But when the country called for all persons, I can best serve my God by serving my country and my oppressed brothers." End quote. So in March of 1863, he joined the Union Army. He was assigned to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. It was the first U.S. Army regiment made up of entirely black guys. It was under the command of Colonel Robert Shaw. He was from a family that was very well known for fighting against slavery. And he promised his troops equal treatment. And the troops were not paid the same as white troops. And so he therefore refused his own pay in protest that his troops weren't being paid equally. And so he refused all pay because of this. In this regiment where William Carney was at, there were also two sons of the famous anti-slavery speaker Frederick Douglass. Well, they went through training. Then on July the 18th of 1863, the 54th Regiment went to battle and attacked the Confederate fort outside of Charleston, South Carolina. It was called Fort Wagner. And as William Carney was with the other guys from the 54th Regiment fighting, there was a Confederate bullet that whizzed past his head as he had bent down to reload, and it hits the person that was carrying the flag. And if the flag falls down, there's going to be disarray in the battle. So what did William Carney do? He runs over to grab the flag before it hits the ground. He is shot in the arm and in the leg. He's able to grab it, and he keeps marching towards Fort Wagner. He gets shot in the chest. He gets shot in the face. Unable to walk, he literally crawls on his knees to Fort Wagner and holds the flag where the troops can there take the battle to the Confederates. Colonel Shaw winds up getting killed during the battle, and the retreat is sounded for the regiment. People come to take the flag and say, "Come on, Carney, let's go back," but he refuses to release the flag to everyone until he gets back behind the lines and back to the tent. And there he finally released the flag, and he did it with these words. He says, "Boys, I only did my duty. The old flag never touched the ground." He was promoted to sergeant for his valor during that battle, and he became the first African American to ever win the Congressional Medal of Honor. All because he says, "I think that the American flag deserves respect and should never touch the ground," and he went to fight for it. He put a love of country before himself. Heroes like Colonel Shaw, Sergeant Carney, and the men of the 54th Regiment are memorialized in the song "America the Beautiful," which says, "Who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life." On this Flag Day, let us remember those like Sergeant William Carney and Colonel Shaw, who gave so much to show respect to the American flag.